The avoidant carries awareness of your absence through every defended day, experiencing your loss as persistent background ache they refuse to acknowledge, as constant recognition of something missing they will not name, as ongoing awareness that their life contains less warmth and meaning without you in it. Yet this missing remains completely silent, trapped beneath defensive walls that prevent the avoidant from expressing longing, from reaching out to repair what their patterns destroyed, from admitting even to themselves that they made devastating mistake by choosing defended isolation over vulnerable connection with you. The avoidant's ego structure, their carefully constructed self-concept as independent person who needs no one, as superior party who recognized the relationship's limitations, as someone whose patterns were justified and whose departure was correct choice, prevents them from acting on the missing they continuously experience. This ego investment in being right about their defensive position, in maintaining belief that their emotional unavailability was reasonable, in preserving narrative that they made wise choice by prioritizing defended comfort over intimate relationship, creates prison where the avoidant sits with constant missing they cannot express, without dismantling the very self-concept that has organized their psychological survival. Years can pass with the avoidant missing you in complete silence, successfully maintaining their defended narrative, continuing patterns that destroyed connection with you while applying those same patterns to new relationships that inevitably fail in similar ways. Then something shifts. The accumulation of losses, the pattern's repetition across multiple relationships, the visible evidence of peers building lives of genuine intimacy while the avoidant remains isolated, the undeniable awareness that defended position has cost them everything meaningful. All these forces converge to create crisis the avoidance ego structure cannot withstand. The defensive narratives that protected the avoidant from confronting their pattern's costs collapse under weight of reality that can no longer be denied, dismissed, or rationalized away. The avoidant faces with devastating clarity that their defended position did not protect them but imprisoned them, that their patterns did not represent strength but reflected limitation, that losing you was not inevitable result of incompatibility, but direct consequence of their inability to sustain intimacy with someone remarkable who deserved far more than the avoidant could provide. The silent missing that masquerades as indifference. The avoidant maintains carefully constructed exterior of complete indifference following the relationship's end, displaying no visible signs of distress, demonstrating apparent ease with the separation, moving forward into their life with surface that suggests your absence barely registers. This performed indifference serves crucial defensive function, protecting the avoidant from having to acknowledge the vulnerability of caring deeply about someone they pushed away, from admitting that losing you created meaningful loss rather than welcome relief, from confronting that their patterns destroyed something valuable they now desperately miss. The avoidance presentation communicates to themselves and others that the relationship was insignificant, that your departure changed nothing essential, that they remain unaffected and self-sufficient. Yet beneath this defended exterior, the avoidant carries constant awareness of your absence. They think about you with far greater frequency than they would ever acknowledge, experience your loss as persistent background presence in their consciousness, carry ongoing recognition that something essential has disappeared from their life. This internal missing operates continuously while remaining completely invisible to external observation. The avoidant experiences the longing while simultaneously maintaining defensive posture that denies the longing exists. They miss you every day while appearing to anyone observing them, including sometimes to themselves during moments of successful suppression, as if they have moved on completely and feel nothing about your absence. The silent missing manifests in countless small moments the avoidant never discusses or acknowledges. They think of something you would find interesting, an experience flash of wanting to share it with you, before their defenses remind them that sharing is no longer possible. They encounter difficulty and briefly wish you were there to provide the support you once offered, before their defended self-sufficiency rejects the wish as weakness. They observe something beautiful or meaningful, an experience moment of your absence, feeling particularly acute before defensive distraction, redirects their attention elsewhere. These moments occur daily, sometimes multiple times per day, Yet the avoidant treats each one as isolated incident without significance, rather than recognizing them as evidence of sustained longing. The avoidant also misses you through the emptiness they feel in their defended isolation, but refuse to connect to your specific absence. The avoidant experiences their life as somewhat hollow, notices that days feel less engaging than they remember, recognizes vague dissatisfaction with their existence. Yet the avoidant does not acknowledge that this emptiness stems directly from losing you, that the hollowness reflects your absence, that the dissatisfaction emerges from recognition that defended isolation provides none of the warmth that connection with you offered. The avoidant experiences the consequences of losing you while maintaining defensive belief that those consequences have nothing to do with you specifically, and everything to do with life's general emptiness or their own sophisticated preference for solitude. This silent missing includes awareness of your specific qualities that the avoidant now recognizes they took for granted. The avoidant remembers your patience with their patterns, your understanding of their defensive structure, your capacity to remain steady despite their withdrawal. They recall specific moments of your care, particular instances of your support, concrete examples of your investment in them despite their minimal reciprocation. These memories surface regularly, creating ongoing awareness of what they lost. Yet the avoidant does not act on this awareness because acting would require admitting they were wrong about their patterns, wrong about the relationship, wrong about their defensive choice to prioritize isolation over connection. The avoidant's silent missing also operates through constant comparison of their current life to what existed when you were present. The avoidant notices that activities feel less enjoyable, that accomplishments feel less meaningful, that their existence contains less satisfaction than it did during the relationship. Yet the avoidant attributes these observations to anything other than your absence. They tell themselves they are experiencing normal life fluctuation, that their dissatisfaction stems from work stress or other circumstances, that their reduced joy reflects general life challenges rather than specific loss of you. This defensive attribution allows the avoidant to experience missing you while denying that the missing relates to you at all. The silence surrounding the avoidance missing serves to protect their ego from having to acknowledge error. If the avoidant were to express that they miss you, they would have to confront that their defensive patterns destroyed something valuable, that their choice to leave or to remain emotionally unavailable until you left was mistake rather than wisdom, that their defended position has cost them relationship that could have enriched their life if they had possessed capacity to show up differently. The avoidance ego cannot tolerate this acknowledgement, so the missing must remain completely silent, experienced internally but never expressed externally, recognized at some level but never fully acknowledged, even in private self-reflection. The avoidant maintains this silent missing for months or years, successfully keeping the longing buried beneath defended narratives that justify their patterns and minimize your importance. The avoidant tells themselves they made the right choice, that the relationship could not have worked, that they are better off alone, that you wanted too much, that their patterns were justified given their limitations. These narratives allow the avoidant to experience missing you while simultaneously maintaining ego investment in having been right to let you go. The silent missing exists in constant tension with defensive narratives, creating internal state where the avoidant simultaneously longs for you and denies the significance of that longing, what finally causes the ego collapse. The avoidance ego structure can maintain defensive narratives against substantial contradictory evidence for extended periods, sometimes for years or even decades. The ego's investment in being right about defensive patterns, in maintaining belief that emotional unavailability was justified, in preserving self-concept as independent person who made wise choices, creates powerful resistance to acknowledging that those patterns were destructive rather than protective. Yet certain accumulations of experience eventually overwhelm even the most defended ego structure, creating collapse where defensive narratives can no longer hold against the weight of undeniable reality. The collapse typically begins with pattern repetition that becomes impossible to ignore or externalize. The avoidant loses not just you, but subsequent relationships that follow eerily similar trajectory. Each new connection starts with promise before the avoidant's defensive patterns recreate familiar dynamic, gradual withdrawal, eventual partner exhaustion, relationship dissolution. After the third or fourth repetition of this pattern, after watching multiple different people in different circumstances, eventually leave citing remarkably similar complaints about the avoidant's emotional unavailability. The avoidant's ability to blame others for relationship failures begins crumbling. The common denominator becomes undeniable. The avoidant is the consistent element across all these failed connections, and this recognition begins eroding the ego's defensive narratives about others being too demanding or incompatible. The collapse accelerates when the avoidant observes peers who once shared their defended position successfully developing intimate partnerships. The avoidant watches friends who struggled with vulnerability learn to sustain relationships, observes acquaintances who once maintained similar defensive distance gradually develop capacity for intimacy, sees people who began from defended positions, similar to the avoidant's own, eventually building satisfying partnerships. These observations force uncomfortable recognition that defended position is not fixed limitation, but rather modifiable pattern. That others with similar starting points have developed capacities the avoidant continues to lack. That the avoidant's continued isolation reflects choice or inability, rather than inevitable consequence of their nature. Time itself becomes force that erodes the avoidant's ego defenses as years accumulate without the avoidant building anything lasting or meaningful in relational domain. The avoidant reaches milestone ages, 40, 50, beyond, and must confront that decades have passed with them maintaining defended isolation, that their life lacks the intimate connections that give existence depth and meaning, that they face their remaining years with prospect of continued solitude. This temporal awareness creates pressure that younger avoidants can avoid by telling themselves they have time to develop connections later. The aging avoidant faces that later has arrived and they have built nothing, that their defended position has consumed their prime relational years, that opportunity for building lasting, intimate partnership may be diminishing or gone. The collapse often intensifies when the avoidant faces significant life difficulty without adequate support system. Illness, career failure, loss of parent, financial crisis, or other major challenge exposes the cost of the avoidant's defended isolation in concrete rather than abstract terms. The avoidant discovers they have no one to depend on during genuine need, that their defended independence has left them alone, facing challenges that intimate partnership would help navigate. This recognition that defended position has practical costs beyond merely missing intimate connection forces, acknowledgement that the avoidance patterns have created life that is not just emotionally empty, but practically unsustainable during difficulty. The ego collapse particularly accelerates when the avoidant sees concrete evidence of your thriving without them. The avoidant observes you in healthy relationship, sees you radiating happiness they never witnessed while you were with them, watches you build life that appears rich and satisfying. This observation destroys the avoidant's defensive narrative that you were the limited party, that you wanted too much, that the relationship failed because of your inadequacy. Your visible thriving proves that you possess capacity for healthy partnership, that your needs were reasonable and can be met by someone less defended, that the relationship's failure stemmed from the avoidant's limitations rather than from yours. This evidence becomes impossible for the avoidant's ego to rationalize away. The collapse reaches critical point when the avoidant experiences rare moment of complete honesty with themselves, when their defenses temporarily lower enough to allow undistorted assessment of their life and patterns. This moment often arrives during crisis, during profound loneliness, during period when the avoidance defenses are overwhelmed by circumstances and cannot maintain their usual protective narratives. In this moment of clarity, the avoidant sees their patterns accurately, recognizes what those patterns have cost them, acknowledges that their defensive position has destroyed opportunities for intimacy while providing none of the safety or satisfaction it promised. The avoidant faces that they have been lying to themselves about their patterns, about their choices, about whether they are okay with defended isolation. The final catalyst for ego collapse often involves the avoidant recognizing that specific person you represented opportunity they will likely never encounter again. The avoidant faces that you are not merely adequate partner they could replace, but rather remarkable person who offered patience and understanding, most people would never provide, who created safety few others could create, who possess specific qualities the avoidant has not found replicated elsewhere. This recognition that they lost someone irreplaceable, rather than merely losing one relationship among many potential relationships, destroys the avoidant's defensive minimization of your importance and of what losing you means for their future relational prospects. The ego collapse arrives not as single moment, but as culmination of these accumulated forces that eventually overwhelm the avoidant's defensive structure. The pattern repetition, the peer comparison, the passage of time, the practical costs of isolation, the evidence of your thriving, the moments of clarity, the recognition of your irreplaceability, all these elements compound across months or years until the avoidance ego can no longer maintain its defensive narratives. The carefully constructed self-concept as independent person who made wise choices collapses under weight of undeniable reality. The avoidance patterns have destroyed everything meaningful, have created exactly the isolation and loss the defensive structure was supposed to prevent, have cost the avoidant the very intimacy and connection that could have made their life rich and satisfying. The devastating recognition that their defenses destroyed what mattered. The ego collapse forces the avoidant into undefended confrontation with reality their defensive structure has spent years obscuring, that their patterns did not protect them from pain, but rather guaranteed the very losses they most feared, that their emotional unavailability did not preserve their autonomy, but rather created profound isolation, that their defended position destroyed their best opportunity for intimate connection with someone who genuinely cared for them. This recognition arrives with devastating emotional weight, precisely because the avoidant has successfully avoided it for so long. The accumulated denial makes the eventual acknowledgement more crushing than if the avoidant had confronted their pattern's cause gradually across time. The avoidant faces that their defensive structure, which they believed was keeping them safe, was actually their primary source of harm. The walls they built to prevent others from hurting them became the prison that prevented them from experiencing genuine connection. The emotional distance they maintained to protect themselves from vulnerability became the mechanism that destroyed every relationship they entered. The independence they claimed to value revealed itself as defended isolation that left them profoundly alone. The avoidant recognizes that they have been their own worst enemy, that they destroyed what mattered most through the very patterns they believed were protecting them. This recognition extends to specific acknowledgement of what they lost in you. The avoidant sees with painful clarity that you were not the problem they needed to escape, but rather the solution they were too defended to accept. You offered patience they did not deserve and failed to appreciate. You provided understanding they took for granted while it was available. You created safety they could not receive because their defensive structure prevented them from recognizing safety when it existed. You demonstrated care they minimized and dismissed rather than valuing and reciprocating. The avoidant faces that they had access to a remarkable person who was willing to work with their limitations, and they squandered that access through consistent emotional unavailability. The devastating quality of this recognition intensifies as the avoidant acknowledges that their defensive narratives about the relationship were lies they told themselves to avoid accountability. The avoidant faces that you were not too needy, they were too defended. You were not asking for too much, they were offering too little. You were not unable to accept them, they were unable to show up adequately. Every defensive story the avoidant constructed to blame the relationship's failure on you or on circumstances collapses under honest examination. The avoidant must acknowledge that they created the outcome they experienced through their own patterns rather than being victim of incompatibility or others' inadequacy. The avoidant also confronts the cumulative cost of their patterns across their entire relational life. The recognition extends beyond just losing you to acknowledging that their defensive structure has destroyed every intimate connection they have attempted, that they have left trail of hurt people and failed relationships across years or decades, that they have never successfully sustained intimacy with anyone because their defenses prevent the vulnerability that intimacy requires. The avoidant faces pattern of destruction they created, recognizing themselves as architect of their own isolation rather than as victim of others' failure to understand or accept them. This devastating recognition includes acknowledgement of time lost that cannot be recovered. The avoidant faces that they spent months or years with you maintaining defended distance, when they could have been building genuine intimacy, that they wasted opportunity to develop relationship that could have sustained across lifetime, that the time they had access to you is gone and cannot be reclaimed, regardless of whether you would consider reconciliation. The avoidant confronts that they cannot go back and show up differently during the relationship, cannot undo the pain their patterns caused you, cannot recover the potential the relationship held, that their defenses prevented from being realized. The recognition also forces the avoidant to face what their life has become as a result of their patterns. The avoidant sees that they live in defended isolation that provides none of the satisfaction or meaning that intimate connection offers. They recognize that their accomplishments feel hollow without someone to share them with, that their independence has become loneliness, that their life lacks the warmth and depth that genuine partnership creates. The avoidant must acknowledge that defended position has not led to the fulfilling autonomous life they claim to want, but rather has created existence that feels increasingly empty and meaningless as they face it honestly. The devastating quality peaks as the avoidant recognizes that changing their patterns requires confronting the very terror their defensive structure exists to prevent. The avoidant faces that developing capacity for genuine intimacy would require sitting with overwhelming vulnerability, would demand examining the wounds that created their defensive structure, would necessitate feeling the feelings they have spent lifetime avoiding. The avoidant understands that transformation is possible, but would require psychological work more difficult than anything they have previously attempted. Work they may lack courage or capacity to complete despite finally recognizing its necessity. The avoidant also confronts the possibility that even if they develop capacity for greater intimacy, they may have permanently lost access to you. The recognition that their patterns destroyed connection with someone remarkable does not guarantee they can repair that connection. The avoidant faces that you may have genuinely moved on, may have built life with someone else, may have no interest in giving the avoidant another opportunity to repeat patterns that hurt you. The avoidant must sit with possibility that their recognition arrived too late, that they finally understand what they lost after the loss has become permanent and irreversible. This recognition creates psychological crisis because it dismantles the avoidant's entire defensive self-concept while offering no immediate resolution. The avoidant can no longer maintain comfortable narratives that justified their patterns, can no longer blame others for relationship failures, can no longer position themselves as superior party who made wise choices. Yet acknowledging these truths does not automatically create capacity to behave differently, does not restore what was lost, does not guarantee that future will be different from past. The avoidant sits in devastation of recognizing their pattern's costs without clear path toward transformation or repair, facing that they destroyed what mattered through defenses they can no longer justify but may still lack capacity to dismantle, how they reach out after the collapse and why it's different. The avoidant who reaches out after genuine ego collapse communicates in ways that differ fundamentally from their previous patterns of contact. The communication carries quality of raw honesty that was absent during all prior interactions, demonstrating vulnerability. The avoidant has spent their life defending against, acknowledging truths the avoidant previously could not face. This transformed communication reflects actual internal shift, rather than temporary panic or strategic attempt to restore the relationship through performed change. The collapsed ego no longer protects the avoidant from recognizing and admitting their pattern's costs, allowing communication that directly addresses what the avoidant previously could only deny or minimize. The avoidance contact after collapse typically begins with genuine accountability rather than with defensive explanations or justifications. The avoidant acknowledges directly that their patterns destroyed the relationship, that their emotional unavailability hurt you in ways you did not deserve, that losing you was consequence of their own defensive limitations rather than result of incompatibility or your excessive needs. This accountability arrives without the qualifications and rationalizations that characterized the avoidant's previous discussions of relationship difficulties. The avoidant no longer explains their patterns as justified response to your behavior or as inevitable result of their nature. They simply acknowledge that they were wrong, that they failed you, that they destroyed something valuable through their defended withdrawal. The communication also includes specific recognition of what you offered and what the avoidant failed to adequately value or reciprocate. The avoidant names particular qualities you demonstrated: your patience, your understanding, your consistent care despite their inconsistent presence. They acknowledge concrete instances where you showed up for them while they withdrew from you, where you offered support they could not reciprocate, where you maintained hope they did not earn. This specific recognition demonstrates that the avoidant has actually examined the relationship honestly rather than speaking in vague generalities designed to elicit your sympathy without requiring genuine self-examination. The collapse avoidance communication notably lacks the typical requests or demands that characterize their previous contact. The avoidant is not reaching out to restore the relationship on their terms, not asking you to give them another chance based on promises of change, not attempting to convince you that things would be different this time. Instead, the communication often focuses simply on acknowledging the truth, on taking responsibility for harm caused, on expressing genuine regret without expectation of forgiveness or reconciliation. The avoidant understands that they have no right to ask anything of you, that you owe them nothing, that their contact serves primarily to acknowledge reality they previously denied rather than to secure outcome they desire. This transformed quality of communication also manifests in the avoidant's response to your boundaries or to your lack of response. The avoidant who has genuinely collapsed does not pursue if you do not respond, does not pressure you to engage, does not become angry or defensive if you maintain distance. They respect your choice completely because the ego collapse has forced recognition that you have every right to protect yourself from someone whose patterns hurt you, that your boundaries reflect healthy self-respect rather than punishment, that the avoidant's desire for contact does not obligate you to provide it. This respect for your autonomy contrasts sharply with the avoidant's previous patterns of becoming withdrawn or cold when you establish boundaries they found uncomfortable. The avoidance communication after genuine collapse also demonstrates awareness of the work they must do, regardless of whether reconciliation becomes possible. The avoidant discusses therapy they have begun, describes efforts to understand their defensive patterns, acknowledges that developing capacity for genuine intimacy will require sustained, difficult work over extended time. This discussion does not serve to convince you they are changing in hopes you will return. Rather, it reflects the avoidant's recognition that they must address their patterns for their own well-being and for any future relationships they might attempt, independent of whether you ever give them another opportunity. The work is not contingent on reconciliation, but rather represents genuine commitment to transformation.